This is the story of a 38-year-old woman whose life ends in a tragic accident, leading her to an encounter with Jesus Christ. In his presence, she is shown the terrifying reality of the Antichrist. Stay tuned to the end of the video to find out what the woman finally saw, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you love Jesus as much as we do, be sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss inspiring content like this.
My name is Isabella Greenfield, and never in my wildest dreams did I imagine dying at 38. My life has been pretty ordinary in suburban Illinois, a place where each season leaves its own vivid mark. Summers are hot and sticky, full of life and activity, while winters bring a stillness that's only interrupted by the hum of snowplows clearing icy streets. I share a modest home with my husband Daniel and our 2 children. Daniel is my steady anchor, hardworking, dependable, and endlessly supportive, even when I don't feel I deserve it. Our kids, Emma and Liam, bring life and love into every corner of our home. Emma, at 10, is thoughtful and creative, while 6-year-old Liam is a whirlwind of energy, seeing the world as one grand adventure waiting to unfold. I work as a middle school teacher, a role that tests every bit of patience I have, but also fills me with purpose. There's something deeply satisfying about watching kids wrestle with new ideas, or witnessing that magical moment when they finally understand something they've been struggling with. It's the kind of work that makes you feel like you're contributing to something larger, even if the results aren't always immediate. Faith has always been part of my life, but not in the way it is for others. I wasn't raised in a deeply religious household. My parents believed in God, sure, but church was more of an occasional event, something we did for weddings, funerals, or maybe a Christmas service if the mood was right. As I grew older, I found myself drawn to spiritual ideas, but never fully committed to any specific path. I prayed when I needed solace, offered thanks when life was kind, and often floated somewhere between belief and doubt. My faith was there, steady but unexamined, like a quiet backdrop to my daily life. My days were full, packed with lesson plans, family dinners, and the never-ending cycle of laundry and dishes. Life in the suburbs has its own rhythm, predictable, comfortable, and sometimes bordering on monotonous. Weekdays were a whirlwind of early mornings and late nights, juggling work, helping Emma with her school projects, and keeping Liam occupied long enough to get dinner on the table. Weekends brought soccer matches, park outings, and the occasional chance to catch up on some much-needed rest. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, and I was happy with that. Now, looking back, I realize how much I took those moments for granted. It's odd how the value of ordinary days only becomes clear once they're gone, or when something extraordinary shakes them apart. At the time, I thought I had life all figured out. I believed I understood the world and my place in it, but I now see how much of it I simply coasted through, how much I overlooked because I was too preoccupied to truly notice. A part of me avoided digging too deeply into my faith. What if I didn't like what I found? What if the answers weren't there? Or, even scarier, what if they were? It felt safer to keep it at arm's length, to believe just enough for comfort but not enough to face any real challenges. I told myself I was spiritual, not religious, and left it at that. What I didn't understand was how this lukewarm approach to faith would leave me completely unprepared for what lay ahead. Suburban Illinois was an ideal setting for someone like me, a safe, predictable bubble where the biggest worry was a rained-out soccer match or a mischievous neighbor's dog knocking over the trash bins. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected life-altering events to unfold. I was just an ordinary woman, living an ordinary life, perfectly content in my cocoon of normalcy. What I didn't know was that my world was about to be turned upside down. My understanding of faith, life, and even myself was about to face a complete upheaval. Had I known, maybe I would have done things differently. Maybe I'd have prayed more, held my children a little tighter, or paid closer attention to those quiet stirrings of faith that had always been there in the background. But I didn't know. So I carried on, oblivious to the storm brewing just ahead. It all began like any other day. My alarm pierced the early morning silence with its sharp, grating beeps, yanking me from the best part of a dream. Daniel was already awake. I could hear the soft clink of his coffee mug from the kitchen. He's always been the morning type, someone who finds joy in the peaceful stillness of those early hours. Me? Not so much. I dragged myself out of bed, still groggy, and shuffled to the bathroom to kick off my morning routine. Mornings in our house were always a bit of a frenzy. Emma and Liam couldn't have been more different when it came to getting ready for school. Emma, ever the responsible one, was usually up before I even called her. By the time I made it to the kitchen, she'd be at the table with her cereal, already engrossed in the book she was reading. Liam, on the other hand, was a different story. Getting him out of bed was like negotiating a peace treaty. It took coaxing, bargaining, and, sometimes, an outright motivational speech to get him moving. That morning was no exception. I found him buried in his blanket, pretending he couldn't hear me. It took the promise of extra screen time after school just to get him to budge. Breakfast was its usual controlled chaos. Daniel had whipped up eggs and toast, his way of pitching in, though he always left the kitchen looking like a small disaster zone. Emma was animatedly chatting about a group project she was excited about, while Liam was nonstop rambling about some superhero show he'd watched. I tried to keep up while mentally ticking off my to-do list: grading papers, a parent-teacher meeting during lunch, and a lesson plan on fractions that I wasn't convinced would hold my students' attention. The drive to school was uneventful, just like always. Dropping the kids off followed our familiar routine. A quick hug for Emma, who was already cringing at being seen with her mom in front of her friends, and a playful fist bump for Liam, who bolted toward the playground without so much as a glance back. As I drove away, that familiar mix of affection and exasperation settled in. They were growing up so quickly, and some days it felt like I was barely keeping up. At school, the day fell into its usual rhythm, the first bell ringing, the shuffle of students settling into their seats, and the background buzz of chatter that always took a few minutes to die down. My students, though a handful at times, held a special place in my heart. They were in that awkward middle stage, not quite kids, but not fully teenagers yet. One moment they'd drive me up the wall, and the next they'd blow me away with their insights. Teaching them was a challenge, but it was also incredibly rewarding. That day, one student stood out, Marcus, who finally solved a math problem he'd been struggling with for days. Seeing his face light up was one of those little moments that reminded me why I love teaching. At lunch, I met with a parent about their child's progress. Nothing too serious, just the usual worries about grades and behavior. I reassured them, as I always did, that their child was doing just fine, that middle school was tough for everyone, and that things would get easier in time. Afterward, I ate my sandwich at my desk, using the quiet moment to catch up on emails and map out plans for the next day. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was mine, and there was a comforting rhythm to it that I appreciated. By the time the final bell rang, I was ready to head home. It had been a good day, busy, but fulfilling. That satisfying kind of tiredness settled in, the kind that comes from knowing you've done your job well. As I packed up my things and said goodbye to a few colleagues, my thoughts drifted to dinner. Daniel had mentioned grilling, and I was already imagining a quiet evening at home with the family. Maybe we'd play a board game or watch a movie together. The thought brought a smile to my face as I pulled out of the school parking lot. The drive home started like any other. Stoplights came and went, and the familiar streets blurred into a comforting backdrop. I glanced at the clock, calculating whether I had time to swing by the store. We needed a few things, and I was debating between a salad or roasted vegetables to go with the grilled chicken. It was such a mundane thought, one of those fleeting moments you never think twice about. It's strange now to reflect on how quickly everything changed. Looking back, I realize how much of that day I took for granted. The laughter over breakfast, the small victories in the classroom, the soothing predictability of my routine. It all felt so steady, so permanent. I didn't know that in mere moments my life would veer into chaos. I didn't know this ordinary day would become the last normal day I'd ever have. It happened in an instant. One moment I was humming along to the radio, lost in my thoughts, and the next, everything exploded into chaos. I didn't see the car that hit me. There was no warning, no chance to react. Just a sudden, violent jolt. The sound of the crash was deafening, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The force of the impact threw me like a rag doll. My hands gripped the steering wheel out of instinct, but it was useless. The car spun out of control, tires screeching against the asphalt. The airbags deployed with a brutal force, slamming into me and leaving me stunned. For a moment, everything was disjointed. It was as though I were both in my body and outside it, watching the scene unfold. Time slowed, stretching seconds into eternity. The world around me fell silent, an eerie, suffocating silence that felt like time itself had stopped. Then came the pain. Not sharp, but a heavy, crushing pressure in my chest. It pinned me down, making it impossible to move. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and my ears rang with faint sounds. Car horns, distant shouts, and the shuffle of approaching footsteps. Everything seemed far away, muffled and unreal. I tried to take a breath, but my lungs refused to cooperate. Panic clawed at me as my mind raced. Was I okay? Were there others involved? Who had hit me? The questions swirled and slipped away, my grasp on them as tenuous as my grip on reality. And then something shifted. It's difficult to describe, but there was a moment when I felt utterly detached from my body. I could see it, slumped over the steering wheel, blood trailing down my forehead, but it didn't feel like me anymore. It was just there, a shell. The pain was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. I wasn't scared. I wasn't anything really. I just existed, suspended in that strange, weightless space. I saw the paramedics arrive. They moved quickly, their voices sharp and urgent as they worked to free me from the wreckage. One of them was shouting something into a radio, and another was leaning into the car, checking for a pulse. I wanted to tell them I was okay, that I could hear them, but no sound came out. It was like I was trapped in this invisible space, watching everything unfold without being able to interact. They got the door open and carefully pulled my body out. I could see the concern on their faces, the way their hands moved with practiced precision as they checked for injuries and started CPR. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and a steady voice, was saying something about not giving up. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her how much her effort meant to me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. Time felt strange. It was like everything was happening both too fast and in slow motion at the same time. I saw them load me onto a stretcher, strapping me in as they worked to stabilize me. The flashing lights of the ambulance cast an eerie glow over the scene, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. Not for myself, but for Daniel, for Emma, and for Liam. What would they do if I didn't make it? The thought of them waiting for me at home, not knowing what had happened, was almost too much to bear. But then something else happened. The light began to change. It wasn't the harsh, flashing red and blue of the ambulance lights anymore. It was softer, warmer, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I felt myself being drawn toward it, like a gentle pull that I couldn't resist. It wasn't frightening. In fact, it was the most peaceful thing I had ever experienced. All the noise, all the chaos, faded away, leaving only this incredible sense of love and calm. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't alone. There was a presence there, something so comforting and reassuring that I felt completely safe, even as I left the scene of the accident behind. It was as if everything I'd ever worried about, every fear and doubt I'd ever had, was being washed away. I didn't understand it, but I didn't need to. All I knew was that something extraordinary was happening, and I couldn't turn back. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just an accident. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the world beyond. As I moved toward the light, the sense of peace grew stronger. It wasn't just an absence of pain or fear. It was an overwhelming feeling of love, like every part of me was being embraced by something so pure, so complete, that it was beyond anything I had ever experienced. The light wasn't blinding or harsh. It was soft and warm, yet radiant in a way that seemed to fill every corner of my being. I felt lighter, freer, as if every burden I'd ever carried had been lifted. It was as though I was finally truly alive, even as I left my body behind. At first, I couldn't see much beyond the light. It was all-encompassing, yet not intimidating. It wasn't like walking through a tunnel, as I'd heard others describe. It was more like being gently drawn forward, as if something or someone was calling me, guiding me. There was no fear, no hesitation, just an instinctive sense of trust. I knew I was going somewhere I was meant to be. Then, as I moved further into the light, I saw him. There are no words to fully describe what it was like to see Jesus Christ. He wasn't how I had imagined him, not exactly. His presence wasn't just a physical form, though he was undeniably real and there, standing before me. It was the way his presence radiated love and understanding, as if he could see every part of me, every thought, every fear, every failure, and still love me completely. His eyes were unlike anything I had ever seen, deep, compassionate, and filled with a wisdom that seemed to span eternity. He didn't speak at first, but I felt his words in my heart. It was as though he was communicating directly with my soul, bypassing language altogether. I could feel his understanding of everything I had been through, every struggle and doubt, even the moments of faith I had pushed aside or ignored. He didn't judge me, though. Instead, there was this immense sense of kindness, of patience, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. When he did speak, his voice wasn't loud or commanding. It was steady and calm, but it carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. "You are here for a reason," he said, and his words resonated deeply within me. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't random. There was a purpose to it, a purpose to me. He reached out, and though he didn't physically touch me, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if every part of me was being realigned, healed in a way I didn't even know I needed. I felt whole in a way I never had before. Then he showed me. It wasn't like watching a movie or even dreaming. It was as if I were living the visions he was revealing, fully immersed in the sights, sounds, and emotions of what was to come. The first thing I saw was the earth, but it wasn't the earth I knew. It was ravaged by storms, earthquakes, and floods, as if the very fabric of creation was tearing itself apart. Cities crumbled, forests burned, and the cries of people echoed all around me. I felt their fear, their desperation, and their helplessness as they faced a world spiraling out of control. But that was just the beginning. The next vision was even more chilling. I saw a man, a figure who at first seemed full of light and promise. He was charismatic, with a presence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He spoke of peace, unity, and solutions to the world's problems. People followed him with an almost blind devotion, desperate to believe in his promises. But there was something underneath his charm, something dark and insidious. His words were like honey, but his intentions were venom. I realized I was seeing the Antichrist. Jesus didn't have to tell me, I just knew. This man wasn't what he appeared to be. He was a deceiver, using his charisma and promises to manipulate and control. I saw how he used technology in ways that seemed miraculous. A global currency system that promised equality, but instead enslaved people. Advanced AI that monitored and controlled every aspect of life, and a surveillance system that left no room for privacy or dissent. He even performed what seemed like miracles, convincing people that he was divine. The world fell under his spell, divided between those who followed him and those who resisted. Those who refused to bow to his system were isolated, persecuted, and labeled as enemies of peace. I saw families torn apart, communities destroyed, and believers in Christ hunted down for their faith. The world he created looked unified on the surface, but it was built on fear, lies, and control. I turned to Jesus, overwhelmed by what I was seeing. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though the words felt inadequate to express the flood of emotions I was feeling. His response was both gentle and firm. "You must understand the times that are coming. You must prepare your heart and help others to do the same. Many will be deceived, but those who remain faithful to me will find hope, even in the darkest of days." He showed me the faithful, small groups of believers who refused to give in to the deception. They were scattered, hidden in pockets of resistance, but their faith was unshakable. They didn't rely on the systems of the world, they relied on him. I saw their courage, their strength, and the way they clung to each other and to Jesus. They were a light in the darkness, a testament to the power of faith. I didn't want to leave his presence. Being with him felt like being home, like every question I'd ever had was answered in a way that words could never express. But he told me it wasn't my time. "You must go back," he said, and though I didn't want to, I understood. There was a purpose for me, a reason I had been shown these things. As the light began to fade, I felt a sense of longing, but also a renewed determination. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, and I couldn't turn away from the calling he had placed on my heart. The visions that Jesus showed me weren't just images, they were experiences. Each one felt so vivid, so real, that I was completely immersed in them. It was as if I had been dropped into the middle of a world that was both familiar and alien, a place that seemed like a distorted reflection of the life I had known. I could feel the weight of what was happening, the emotions of the people around me, the chaos that seemed to pulse through every corner of existence. The first thing I saw was the earth itself, and it was in turmoil. Natural disasters struck with a ferocity I had never imagined. Earthquakes ripped through cities, reducing towering skyscrapers to piles of rubble in seconds. Floods surged through the streets, carrying cars, trees, and even homes in their relentless currents. Fires consumed entire landscapes, turning lush forests into barren wastelands. I could hear the cries of people, their voices filled with fear and confusion as they struggled to understand what was happening. It wasn't just the natural world that was in chaos. The fabric of society was unraveling. Economies collapsed overnight, leaving people desperate and hopeless. Long lines formed outside what few doors remained open, guarded by armed personnel who controlled the dwindling supplies of food and water. I saw the faces of people, parents clutching their children, elderly couples huddled together, young men and women looking lost and defeated. The fear in their eyes was haunting. And then, amidst the chaos, he appeared. At first, the man seemed like a beacon of hope. He was charismatic, with a voice that seemed to soothe the fears of everyone who heard him. He promised solutions, a way to bring peace and order back to the world. People were drawn to him, flocking to him in droves, desperate for the security he offered. He spoke of unity, of breaking down barriers between nations, of creating a world where everyone could thrive together. His words were like music, and they fell on eager ears. I watched as the world began to follow him. Governments aligned themselves with his vision, declaring him a leader unlike any they had ever seen. People hailed him as a savior, believing that he had the power to restore what had been lost. But beneath the surface of his promises, I could feel something sinister. His eyes, though warm and inviting, carried a darkness that sent shivers through me. I knew who he was, even if the world did not. This man, this Antichrist, wasn't acting alone. He wielded tools and powers that seemed almost otherworldly. I saw him use advanced technology to tighten his grip on humanity. One of his most powerful tools was a global currency system. At first, it seemed like a brilliant solution to the economic chaos. People no longer needed cash. Everything was digital, seamless, and efficient. But the system was controlled entirely by him and his followers. Without access to it, people couldn't buy or sell, couldn't feed their families or survive. It became a tool of oppression, used to force people into submission. I saw how he harnessed AI and surveillance technology to monitor every aspect of people's lives. Cameras and sensors were everywhere, watching, recording, analyzing. Privacy became a thing of the past. Anyone who dared to question him, who refused to align themselves with his system, was flagged, isolated, and punished. The technology was so advanced, it seemed almost magical, but it was used to erode freedom and to break the will of anyone who resisted. He performed miracles, at least they seemed like miracles. I watched as he healed the sick, made food appear out of thin air, and even controlled the weather. People were in awe, convinced that he was divine, but I could see the truth. These were not miracles of God. They were deceptions meant to lure people into worshiping him. The line between truth and lies blurred, and many couldn't see the difference. The world he created looked perfect on the surface, peaceful, unified, prosperous, but it was a facade. Beneath it lay control, fear, and deception. Those who refused to follow him were labeled as enemies of progress, of peace. I saw families being torn apart, as some chose to follow the Antichrist while others clung to their faith in Jesus. Believers were hunted down, imprisoned, and even killed. Their communities were infiltrated, their gatherings disrupted, their voices silenced. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, there was light. Jesus showed me the faithful, small groups of believers who refused to bow to the Antichrist or accept his mark. They were scattered, often hiding in remote places, but their faith was unshakable. They prayed together, supported one another, and held on to the promises of God. They didn't rely on the systems of the world, they relied on him. Their courage was incredible. They faced persecution, hunger, and even death. Yet they stood firm, knowing that their hope wasn't in this world, but in the eternal life promised by Jesus. I saw how their faith shone like a beacon in the darkness. It didn't matter how small their numbers were, their belief was powerful and unyielding. They didn't fight with weapons or anger. They fought with love, prayer, and the truth of God's word. They reminded me of a candle burning in a storm, not extinguished, but standing strong, defying the winds that threatened to snuff it out. As the visions unfolded, I felt a deep sense of urgency. Jesus didn't just want me to see these things, he wanted me to understand them, to prepare for them, and to help others do the same. His voice echoed in my heart, calm but firm. The deception will be great, but my truth is greater. Many will be led astray, but those who seek me will find me. Stand firm and do not be afraid. When the visions began to fade, I felt a mix of emotions. The weight of what I had seen was almost unbearable, yet there was hope. I had seen the power of faith, the resilience of those who stood with Jesus even in the face of unimaginable trials. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but I also knew that He would never abandon those who trusted in Him. I was left with a profound sense of responsibility. These visions weren't just for me, they were meant to be shared. Jesus was calling me to be a voice, a witness to what was coming, and to help others prepare, not just for the trials, but for the hope and victory that would ultimately come through Him. As the visions faded and I was left standing in the presence of Jesus, the weight of what I had seen hung heavy in my heart. The images of chaos, deception, and faith etched themselves into my very being, leaving me both shaken and determined. Jesus' gaze met mine, and even though I still felt overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, His presence brought a peace that steadied me. He wasn't just showing me these things to frighten me, He was preparing me. I knew deep in my soul that this was a calling, a purpose I could no longer ignore. Jesus spoke again, and His words were filled with authority and love. What you have seen is the beginning of what must come. The enemy will seek to deceive, to destroy, and to lead many astray. But I have overcome the world, and those who remain in me will not be lost. I clung to His words, letting them sink into my heart. They weren't just a promise, they were a lifeline, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was hope. I felt His love surround me, stronger than anything I had ever known, and it gave me the courage to listen as He continued. You must prepare your heart and help others to do the same, He said, His voice steady but urgent. The times ahead will be difficult. Many will be deceived by the promises of the enemy, but those who know me, who seek me, will recognize the truth. They will not be led astray. I thought about the deception I had seen, the Antichrist's charisma, the technological miracles, the false sense of unity that masked control and oppression. It was so clear now how easy it would be for people to fall into the trap. The promises of peace and prosperity would be tempting, especially in a world desperate for stability. But Jesus was showing me that the price of accepting those lies would be far greater than anyone could imagine. How will they know? I asked Him, my voice trembling. How will people know the truth when everything seems so convincing? Jesus smiled, a small, gentle smile that felt like a balm to my soul. They will know if they know me, He said. The truth is not hidden from those who seek it. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. The enemy's lies cannot stand against my word. Teach them to remain in me, to trust me above all else. His words were simple, but they carried a profound weight. It wasn't about having all the answers or knowing every detail of what was to come. It was about relationships, about knowing Him so deeply that His truth would always shine brighter than any deception. I realized then that this wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation to draw closer to Him, to build a faith so strong that no storm could shake it. Jesus began to reveal specific signs for me to watch for, indicators of the events I had seen beginning to unfold. He spoke about advancements in technology, how tools designed to enhance life would instead be used to control it. He described the introduction of a global currency system, presented as a solution to economic chaos, but destined to become a tool of oppression. He warned of the growing reliance on artificial intelligence and surveillance, how these would erode privacy and freedom, all under the guise of security. These things will happen, he said, but do not be afraid. They are signs, not the end. They are meant to awaken hearts, not bring destruction. I asked about the faithful, the small groups from my visions, those who resisted the Antichrist and held fast to their faith in Jesus. How will they endure? I asked. How will they stand firm when everything is stacked against them? They will not stand alone, he replied. I will be with them. My spirit will guide, strengthen, and sustain them. They will find each other, drawn together by their faith, and they will shine as my light in the darkness. Though few, their faith will be powerful enough to move mountains. Again, I saw those small communities in my mind, hidden, yet united in prayer, lifting one another up. They weren't warriors or prominent leaders, just ordinary people. Yet their faith made them unshakable, stronger than anything the enemy could hurl at them. They lacked material wealth, but they had everything they needed because they had Jesus. Their complete trust in him filled them with a peace the world could never comprehend. Tell them, Jesus urged, his voice urgent yet full of love. Tell them to prepare, not with fear, but with faith. Tell them to build their lives on me, to know my word and recognize my voice. Tell them to seek me now, while there is still time, so they will not waver when the storms come. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. I felt the gravity of his words and the immense responsibility he was entrusting to me. It was overwhelming, yet freeing, because I knew I wasn't alone. He would be with me every step of the way, just as he would be with those who heard and believed. As the light around us began to shift, I felt myself being drawn back. The warmth and brilliance of his presence slowly faded. I didn't want to leave. I longed to stay with him forever. But I understood. I had work yet to do. You must return, he said gently, his voice saturated with love. But remember, I am always with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. As the light dimmed and I felt myself returning to my body, his final words resonated deeply in my heart. Be strong and courageous. The days ahead will be challenging, but my grace is sufficient. Trust in me, and you will not fall. Even now, the weight of that encounter remains with me, the vividness of his presence, the power of his words. They were not meant for me alone. They were for everyone. And I knew, without question, that my life would never be the same. Returning to my body was like awakening from the deepest sleep, yet instead of feeling refreshed, I felt a heavy ache. At first, everything was disorienting. I couldn't recognize where I was or what was happening. My mind wrestled to process the profound experience I had just lived through. It was as if I had been lifted to the highest of heavens, only to be placed back into a world that suddenly felt too small, too restrictive. The first thing I noticed was a steady beeping sound, cutting through the haze in my mind. Then, gradually, voices emerged, faint at first, then growing clearer. Someone was saying my name, their tone laced with a mixture of relief and astonishment. My name, I whispered hoarsely. Isabella, a nurse replied, her voice trembling slightly. You're awake. Her words sounded surreal, like I was hearing them from underwater. Awake? Of course I was awake. But as my mind began to clear, I realized why she sounded so surprised. The accident. The crash. It all came rushing back to me. The impact. The sound of metal crumpling. The moment I saw my body being pulled from the wreckage. For a second, I panicked, my heart racing as I tried to piece it all together. Was it real? Had I truly seen Jesus? Or was it some kind of dream? A hallucination brought on by trauma. Before I could even begin to process these thoughts, Daniel was there. He burst into the room, his face pale and his eyes red from crying. He rushed to my side, grabbing my hand as tears streamed down his face. Isabella, he choked out, you're okay, you're alive. His words hit me like a wave. Alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had made it. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I looked at him, his relief so palpable it was almost overwhelming. He kissed my hand repeatedly, whispering words of gratitude, of love, of sheer disbelief that I was still here. I tried to speak to reassure him, but my voice came out as a croak. My throat felt raw, and every part of my body ached. But I managed to squeeze his hand, letting him know I was there. The doctors came in shortly after, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and amazement. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, introduced himself as Dr. Patel. He began explaining my condition in careful, measured tones. "You suffered severe injuries in the accident," he said, his eyes scanning a clipboard. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and significant trauma to your head and chest. When you arrived, we weren't sure if you would survive." He paused, his gaze softening. "Frankly, it's a miracle you're alive. We've seen recoveries before, but this is extraordinary. Your heart stopped twice during surgery. We had to revive you, and yet here you are, awake, stable. It's nothing short of remarkable." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A miracle. I had heard that word before, but it had never felt as real as it did in that moment. I looked at Daniel, who was nodding along, his lips pressed together as if he were holding back a flood of emotions. The nurse adjusted one of the machines, and I noticed the cross around her neck glinting in the harsh light. I wanted to tell them what I had seen, what I had experienced, but the words wouldn't come. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of recovery, physical therapy, endless tests, and cautious words from the medical staff about taking things slowly. My body was weak, battered, but my spirit felt stronger than it ever had. I spent hours lying in that hospital bed, replaying everything I had seen and heard, the light, the visions, the presence of Jesus. It was all so vivid, so undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a second chance, that I was meant to do something with the time I had been granted. Daniel stayed by my side through it all. He slept in the uncomfortable chair next to my bed, held my hand during the painful moments, and listened patiently when I finally found the strength to speak about what had happened. At first, I was hesitant, unsure of how he would react. How do you even begin to describe something so extraordinary, so far beyond the scope of normal life? But when I told him about the light, about Jesus, and the visions of the future, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He listened, his eyes wide with wonder, and when I finished, he simply said, "I believe you." His faith in me, in my experience, was like a balm to my soul. It gave me the courage to start sharing the story with others, friends, family, even some of the hospital staff who had been curious about my recovery. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some nodded politely, their faces skeptical but kind. Others looked at me with awe, as if they were trying to reconcile the woman before them with the incredible story I was telling. A few outright dismissed it, chalking it up to a near-death hallucination or the effects of medication. But no matter how people responded, I felt an undeniable truth in my heart. What I had experienced was real. Jesus was real. The visions were real, and the warnings he had given me weren't just for me. They were for everyone. The world needed to know what was coming, and more importantly, how to prepare for it. The doctors eventually discharged me, calling my recovery nothing short of miraculous. They attributed it to my will to live, but I knew the truth. It wasn't my will that had brought me back. It was his. I left the hospital a changed woman, not just physically, but spiritually. I wasn't the same person who had gotten into that car before the accident. I had been given a gift, a responsibility, and I knew I couldn't waste it. As I stepped out into the fresh air for the first time in weeks, With Daniel supporting me and the sunlight warming my face, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I was alive, yes, but more than that, I was alive with a purpose. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges I would face, I knew I wouldn't face them alone. Jesus had shown me the way, and I would follow it no matter where it led. Coming home felt surreal, as if I were walking into a life that wasn't entirely mine anymore. Everything looked the same. The kitchen with its slightly chipped countertops, the family photos on the wall, the cozy living room where Daniel and I had spent so many evenings watching movies with the kids. And yet everything felt different. Or maybe it was me. I couldn't look at the world the way I used to, not after what I had experienced. The kids ran to greet me the moment I walked through the door. Emma hugged me gently, her eyes filled with relief, while Liam, oblivious to my injuries, practically launched himself at me. I winced from the pain, but hugged them both tightly, feeling tears well up in my eyes. For a moment, I was just their mom again. No visions, no warnings, just a mother grateful to be alive and home with her family. But the weight of what I had seen never left me. Even in those first few days of being back, as I tried to settle into a routine of rest and recovery, the memories of the visions haunted me. The faces of people deceived by the Antichrist, the faithful hiding in fear yet standing firm, the chaos and destruction. I couldn't shake it. I knew I wasn't meant to. Jesus had shown me these things for a reason, and now that I was home, I needed to figure out what to do with them. At first, I tried to share my experience cautiously, starting with those closest to me. Daniel had already heard the story in the hospital, and he was incredibly supportive. But when I told some of my friends and extended family, their reactions were mixed. Some listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide as I described the light, the presence of Jesus, and the visions of the future. Others smiled politely, clearly unsure whether to take me seriously. A few even dismissed it outright, saying things like, "You've been through a lot. It's probably just your brain trying to make sense of the trauma." Those reactions stung more than I wanted to admit. It was hard enough to put into words something so profound, so deeply spiritual, only to have it brushed aside. But then I remembered the look in Jesus' eyes when he told me to share what I had seen. He hadn't promised it would be easy. He had simply told me to do it. So, I kept trying, even when it was uncomfortable, even when people doubted me. I wasn't sharing my story to convince anyone. I was sharing it because I had to, because the truth of what I had experienced was too important to keep to myself. As the weeks went on, I started noticing things in the world around me, small, subtle signs that seemed to align with the visions Jesus had shown me. News reports about advancements in AI and surveillance technology made me think of the systems the Antichrist would use to control people. Talks of global economic instability reminded me of the fiat currency system I had seen. Even cultural shifts, the growing polarization, the erosion of truth, seemed to echo the warnings I had been given. I couldn't ignore it. The world was changing, slowly but surely, moving toward the events Jesus had shown me. It wasn't happening all at once, and it wasn't obvious to most people, but the signs were there for those who were paying attention. I felt a deep urgency to help others see what I was seeing, to help them prepare, not just for the physical changes, but for the spiritual challenges that lay ahead. The hardest part was figuring out where to begin. I wasn't a preacher or a theologian. I was just a middle school teacher, a wife, and a mom. What could I possibly do to make a difference? I spent hours in prayer, asking Jesus for guidance, for wisdom to know how to carry out the task he had given me. Slowly, I began to realize that I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to take the first step. That step for me was sharing my story with my church. It wasn't easy. I was nervous, afraid of being judged or dismissed, but I knew I couldn't let fear hold me back. When I stood in front of the congregation and began to speak, my voice trembled at first, but as I continued, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I told them everything, from the accident to the visions to the warnings Jesus had given me. By the time I finished, there were tears in my eyes and in the eyes of many in the audience. Afterward, people came up to me, some thanking me for sharing, others asking questions about what they could do to prepare. A few even shared their own stories of spiritual experiences and how they had felt a similar urgency to draw closer to God. It was humbling and encouraging, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey. But it wasn't all positive. Some people were skeptical, even critical, questioning the validity of my experience. One man, a deacon in the church, told me bluntly that he thought I had misunderstood what I saw, that it was likely just a vivid dream brought on by trauma. His words stung, but I reminded myself that my job wasn't to convince anyone. My job was to share the truth as I had experienced it, and to trust God with the rest. At home, my life began to change in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself praying more, reading the Bible with a hunger I had never felt before. Passages that I had skimmed over in the past now seemed to leap off the page, filled with meaning and relevance. I started teaching Emma and Liam about what it means to trust in Jesus, not just in words, but in action. We began having family devotionals, something we had never done before, and I watched as my children started to grow in their own faith. Daniel, too, was changing. He had always been supportive of my faith, even if he wasn't particularly devout himself, but now I saw him beginning to take it more seriously. We started praying together, something we hadn't done since our wedding day, and it brought us closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. Despite these positive changes, I couldn't shake the sense of urgency that hung over me. The world was moving closer to the events I had seen, and I felt a deep responsibility to help as many people as I could. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Jesus had shown me the truth, and now it was my mission to live it, to share it, and to help others prepare for what was to come. As I lay in bed each night, reflecting on the day and praying for guidance, I felt a strange mixture of peace and purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I knew I wasn't walking it alone. Jesus had promised to be with me, and I could feel his presence every step of the way. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them, not because of my own strength, but because of his. The more I reflected on my journey, the more I felt the pull to leave others with a message of hope and urgency. The things I had experienced, the truths I had been shown, they weren't meant to stay with me alone. I knew that deep in my soul, they were meant to ripple outward, touching lives, awakening hearts, and preparing people for what was to come. This wasn't just my story. It was God's calling for everyone who was willing to listen. I sat at the kitchen table one evening, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the kids moved in their rooms. Daniel sat across from me, his eyes warm but concerned. "You've been so quiet," he said, his hand reaching out to cover mine. "What's on your mind?" I looked at him, searching for the right words. "I feel like I need to do more," I said finally. "I've shared my story with some people, but it's not enough. There's so much more to say, so much more to prepare for. I feel like I'm carrying this message, this burden, and I don't know how to get it out there." He nodded, his face thoughtful. "You've already done so much," he said. "But if you feel like there's more, then maybe it's time to take a leap of faith." His words stayed with me long after we'd gone to bed. A leap of faith. That's exactly what it felt like, stepping into the unknown, trusting that God would guide me even when I couldn't see the way forward. I prayed about it that night, pouring out my heart to Jesus and asking for his direction. "Show me what to do," I whispered. Use me however you need to. Just help me be faithful." The next morning, I woke up with a newfound sense of clarity. I realized I didn't need to have every answer right away. I just needed to take the next step forward. For me, that step was clear. I needed to share my story on a larger scale. I began pouring my heart onto paper, writing down every detail, every vision, and every word Jesus had spoken to me. It wasn't easy. Reliving the accident, the visions of destruction, and the moments of doubt was painful. But as I wrote, I felt Jesus' presence with me, gently guiding my thoughts and reminding me that this story wasn't about me. It was about him and the message he had entrusted to me. Once I finished, I shared my writings with a few close friends and family members. Their reactions were a mix of emotions. Some were deeply moved to tears, while others felt inspired to strengthen their own faith. One friend, a pastor, urged me to take the next bold step. "People need to hear this," he said earnestly, "now more than ever." That was the moment I decided to go public. I started by speaking at local churches and community gatherings. Standing in front of that first crowd, my hands trembled with nerves. I feared being judged, dismissed, or labeled as crazy. But as I began to share, something incredible happened. The fear faded, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about telling my story. It was about delivering a message of hope and urgency, a call to prepare, not through fear, but through faith. I spoke about the light, the overwhelming presence of Jesus, and the vivid visions of the future I had experienced. I described the rise of the Antichrist, the widespread deception that would lead many astray, and the small yet powerful groups of believers who would stand firm in their faith. I didn't shy away from the challenges, but I also made sure to emphasize the hope that remained. Yes, the enemy's power is real, I said, but God's power is far greater. Those who remain faithful and build their lives on Jesus will not be defeated. As I spoke, I saw the audience leaning in, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Afterward, many approached me, some with heartfelt questions about how to prepare, and others simply expressing gratitude, their faces radiating quiet resolve. I could see the message taking root, planting seeds of faith and action in their hearts. But this journey wasn't just about speaking to crowds or delivering powerful messages. It was also about the quiet, personal moments of faith in my own home. I dedicated more time to my children, teaching them the importance of knowing Jesus on a personal level. Together, we read the Bible, prayed, and had open conversations about the world and what it meant to truly follow Christ. I encouraged them to ask questions, to explore their faith deeply, and to seek truth for themselves. I wanted them to be ready, not just for the trials and challenges ahead, but for the immense joy and peace that came from truly knowing and walking with Jesus. At the same time, I began to notice changes within myself. My faith grew stronger, and my trust in Jesus became unwavering. I found power in prayer, peace in Scripture, and a sense of direction that carried me through even the toughest days. I stopped worrying so much about what others thought of me, and instead focused on following God's call. It wasn't always simple. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But during those times, I would return to the promise Jesus made: "I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you." As the months passed, I started to see signs in the world that reflected the visions Jesus had shown me: the rapid growth of technology, the push for global solutions, the deepening divisions, and the crumbling of truth. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had foretold. I shared these insights with others, not to frighten them, but to help them understand the importance of staying alert and rooted in their faith. Through everything, my message stayed the same. Prepare your hearts. Strengthen your relationship with Jesus now, while there is still time. The days ahead will be tough, but those who stay faithful will find hope, strength, and salvation. As I write these words today, I can feel their weight. This journey has been one of the most difficult and transformative experiences of my life, but it has also been the most rewarding. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this: Jesus is with us, leading us, and offering us a hope that no one and nothing can take away. As long as I breathe, I will continue to share that hope with anyone who is willing to listen.